related to each vote.
Well, correct me. So, Emily, I know you helped collect data for this. And these, when you say, did they vote or did they not vote, this is using the 706 vote of the electorate, correct? So this is following the process outlined in 46. So this would not include communities that had votes that did not meet the 706.
Correct.
Okay. So I think that's where you're talking about apples and oranges. These are apples to apples. These are, were they 706 vote on the electorate? So you will see that there were votes in other communities that maybe didn't follow this process. They might have been votes on things like, we've seen ones of closing schools or this, so they're all over the map.
We've heard polls,
Right.
Outside election areas where they've done some polling. We've heard school board meetings. I mean, we've been presented with a lot of different data that suggests that the community has a sentiment one way or the other. You're right that the 706 is the clear process, but over the last 3 meetings and even prior to that, we've heard a lot of discussion from local officials about different votes and different ways that they've solicited information from their communities that may agree or disagree with the position of that board or the Act 46 process in its own right.
So when I asked the agency to create and to put this data together, I was looking for what was actually following the law. So those other things that we can talk about and see as the different oranges and bananas or whatever you want to say, but these are the apples to apples. This is what was asked for in Act 46 by law, and this is what communities did to meet those requirements. So that is where there may be, and there are communities that had their own process, and that can be something that this board will look at and determine what we want to do with that information. But this is itself, they were following what the law had asked them to do.
I guess my point with this though is that when you look at it, there are some communities that the vote was overwhelmingly no. Then there's some votes where it was very close. And then we've also heard information from people that have offered testimony to us where there may have been misinformation in the community. And that's why I'm saying, like, when you look at this, not every vote, a vote that went down by 2 votes, do we weigh that more heavily than a vote that went down? I mean, there were some that were like 100 to 1. And there's others that were 99 to 100.
John and then Oliver?
Well, while we've been talking, I've been skipping ahead to principles, just to see what's emerging from this discussion.
That's where we're headed.
So if I may, if you'll indulge me, two principles have emerged from our discussion, I think. The one is that the board indeed has the authority granted to it, in fact directed by the General Assembly, to overrule or reorganize the governance of districts who have presented AGS proposals. That would be a conclusion, if you will, and might operate as a principle, that we have this authority. The second part of that is, might be, our second principle might be that the board recognizes that the will of the people is central to our Republican system of governance. And by the first principle above, the board recognizes and abides by the will of the one body, the General Assembly, that has authority to direct organization or reorganization of local education. So if you take that as a principle, then there's simply no point in quibbling or speculating or debating whether this vote was legitimate because it was done by that kind of vote and all of that. There's nothing in sections 9 and 10 that may even recognize the power or importance of a vote. And you couldn't say that that's just an oversight of the General Assembly because the General Assembly had explicitly provided for that in the voluntary mergers. So we have to take the legislature at its word, that it either didn't contemplate or didn't care or didn't have any opinion about local votes of any sort, polls, duly warned votes. So I think if you get to the principle that in fact the local vote that matters is who got elected to the General Assembly and wrote this thing, then we needn't spend any further time, I would submit, speculating or quibbling about whether a poll or a vote represents the sentiment of the people.
I think it's a good place to start.
Okay, all right. Thank you, John. So putting this up, we have the two memos that we asked for and that were provided by the agency to help us. And John is going through and jumping forward into that development of the guiding principles. But before we move on to that, is there any clarification about legal requirements, obligations, and duties under the law that people want to discuss or comment or have questions on?
Maybe not now. I think we'll cover it under a principle, but I think there needs to be some discussion about the debt provision, because we have to spend some time defining for ourselves the meaning of possible, which I think is going to be very simple, practicable, and then greatly varying levels of indebtedness.
Yeah. And I guess, Kyle, following up a little bit on Oliver's point, maybe it's just a direct ratio. I don't know how you'd look at it and say, well, this one looks like it has a lot more debt than that one. I mean, maybe it's an actual ratio of debt from one community to the next that says that the merger is not practicable because one community has a lot more debt. I think, if you get into the absolutes, the saying, well, one community has $1 million in debt and the other one has $1.1 million, I think that's kind of maybe squabbling over numbers. But if one had $15 million in debt and one had no debt, maybe that would make it more difficult to do the merger. So I think, but maybe it's actually just coming up with a real ratio.
So we'll hold off on that. The other counter argument to that is you could have $50 million in debt in one community, and the other community could have $50 million in deferred maintenance and no debt.
True. Yep.
All right, so I'm hearing that people are satisfied with, you would ask to talk about obligations and duties. And John, did you have another?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's a difference between obligations and principles. And what I described to you were what I regard as principles, though you might think of them as differently. But I think the obligation can be stated pretty simply, that we have an obligation to carry out the directives of the General Assembly. I mean, that's our first, and I don't know of any other obligation than that, to do with a duly elected Democratic/Republican process, legislative body directs us to do. And we exist at their sufferance, and it's our obligation to carry forward what they direct us to do to the best of our ability. So that's, to me, our obligation. How we go about doing that might be guided by a series of principles.
I would concur with that, and just to add on to that, we have a duty to, basic canon of law is that interpreting law is to start with the plain meaning. That is there's been a lot of discussion around legislative intent. Legislative intent, trying to define divine legislative intent, only comes into play when the plain meaning is not clear. We've identified a few areas where we have to have some discussion, but the actual process is pretty clearly laid out, and if we need to stick to the plain meaning of what the statute tells us and what the General Assembly asked us to do. So I would concur with your point.
Mark?
Yeah, hard to disagree with anything I've heard so far. One of the things that we haven't talked about specifically is leadership, and leadership that we're going to have through this process, leadership that the AOE's had, leadership that the legislature's had. But at the end of the day, it's about the leadership in our communities and running these school systems. And we have a system on the books already in statutes called supervisory unions or supervisory districts. And when we get done doing our work, it's still going to be up to the local people to provide that leadership. And it's important that we never forget that through our discussion.